Hi, my name is Bryn Griffiths. Welcome to the Labour Left podcast. Today I welcome Geoff Bell from Labour for Irish Unity onto the show. As a young student activist in Derry, Geoff participated in the early Irish civil rights movement of the 1970s. I first came across Geoff when in the 1980s, as a young student, I read his excellent pamphlet on the cost of Labour's bipartisanship. Since then, he's contributed a lot to our understanding of Ireland, with numerous books and a documentary for Channel 4 called Pack Up the Troubles. His most famous book, The Protestants of Ulster, published in 1976, has been reprinted an impressive 5 times. His latest book, which came out very recently, is The Twilight of Unionism. How are you doing, Geoff?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
I read your chapter in Michael Farrell's book, 20 Years On, and you said that during the events in Derry of the late 1960s and early 1970s, you gained a political education like of which few contemporary European socialists have been privileged of receiving.
As you said, I was a student in Derry from 1966 to 1968. And I should sort of say this at the start, I came from a sort of Protestant background, so I didn't really know an awful lot because being the nature of Protestant education, you don't really know a lot about the other side, so to speak. But I was interested in things like Irish music and so on. So anyway, I was a student there then from 66 to 68, and I joined the Derry Labour Party. Now, the Derry Labour Party was actually the Derry branch of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, but we never called it the branch of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. We just called it the Derry Labour Party to try and get support of people who wouldn't support anything with the words Northern Ireland in its title. Anyway, this was then being revived by a couple of people, namely Eamon McCann and Dermy McClenaghan, who were turning this Derry Labour Party.
That's Eamon McCann of War in an Irish Town, isn't it?
That's right. Eamon McCann, who later wrote War in Irish Town. So anyway, we were involved in essentially housing issues and civil rights issues, and the fact that housing by the local council tended to give houses mainly to Protestants, apart from the ones in sort of Catholic areas, but even then they gave some in sort of Catholic areas. So there was widespread discrimination in terms of housing allocation, in terms of the way the boundaries for local government were drawn up. They were gerrymandered. In terms of even the people who were allowed to vote in the local council elections. There was widespread discrimination at that time in Northern Ireland, which has been documented many times. We were involved in sort of fighting that, if you like. And I say we, I mean, I was a very junior player. I think I described myself as a megaphone carrier for Eamon. So I mean, that was the sort of role I had. But anyway,
we decided probably gave you a good vantage point.
We decided to hold a march for civil rights in Derry at this time, and this started in one part of the city which tended to be a Protestant area, and the march was banned, the civil rights march. This was on the 5th of October 1968 by the then Northern Ireland government. It was then at that stage, of course, Northern Ireland was run by its own devolved parliament. And they sort of banned this march. So it was a very relatively small number. Many of us gathered there, about 400 or 500 people gathered there, and we tried to march, and we were attacked by the RUC, the police. Unfortunately for us, the TV cameras were there, and they recorded some of the rather vicious assault which the RUC subjected us to, and I was hit over the head with a baton. Fortunately, I had very bushy hair at that stage, so it probably made it less. It didn't really hurt very much or anything. But this was then flashed on the sort of television screens around the world. And it was flashed, and the story was very favorable to us. The marchers, there were we 400 or 500 people. All we were asking for were sort of civil rights, and we were battened down by these police people. And that really, in many ways, has been seen as the start of the Northern Ireland Troubles. You know, that many people date the Troubles from that march, because what the effect of that march, especially among the Catholic communities.
Was it the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 60s that gave you your inspiration?
That was sort of one of the influences, yes. But I mean, obviously, this was also the time of protests against Vietnam. It was the time of the May Spring in sort of 1968 and the Paris and all these sorts of things. So there was this general youth rebellion going on across the world, really. And I think we saw ourselves, at least some of us saw ourselves, as part of that, rather than some sort of Irish nationalist movement or anything like that. You know, we saw ourselves as part of the youth revolt. But at the same time, the whole Derry thing was essentially made up not of students, but of working class Catholics, right? That made it a bit different from what was happening elsewhere. That it was mainly sort of working class people who were involved in these protests. And the protests took place, as I say, mainly in sort of Catholic sort of areas. So anyway, the October the 5th thing was, you know, I mean, for me, a young sort of Protestant boy who was a bit of a sort of liberal, if you like, this whole thing was a bit of a shock. I mean, obviously, I knew about the sectarian nature of the Northern Ireland state, but for stopping you, but to try and stop you marching, for which was just a very liberal cause, and then to attack you in the sort of way they did, it started obviously raised questions in my head about the nature of the state and so on, and well, why were they doing this, you know? So anyway, I at this stage I moved to Dublin Trinity because that was the next stage of my sort of education. But I went back to sort of Derry on a number of occasions. So I went back in 1969, August 1969. By this time, the civil rights movement had grown in support and in protests, but it was still largely a peaceful movement. And at the start, the civil rights movement was a sort of pacifist movement. It by this time had sort of grown. So I went back to Derry in August 1969 because we knew there was a orange demonstration taking place, and this orange demonstration was threatening to march into the Bogside area, and that was a sort of Catholic area. So we were up there to defend them from basically the Orange Marchers, and the Orange Marchers supported by the police. And that was when the Battle of Bogside took place. And this was the Bogside area was barricaded off from.
That's where the phrase "Free Derry" comes from, Geoff.
Yeah. This was when Free Derry was established, which was an attempt, if you like. I mean, what had happened previously was that the RUC had gone into the area, raided the area, and had beaten people up, and on one occasion killed someone when they raided a house. And this person, a Catholic, was a totally innocent person. He wasn't involved in sort of anything. He was just happened to live in the area. And so the barricades were sort of set up to defend the area from that type of incursion by the police. And so in sort of August 1969, the police again tried to enter Bogside. And for 3 nights and 3 days, we fought against them. There was no guns or anything. And part of that, it was sort of petrol bombs and stones and things. And they replied with CS gas and plastic bullets, or was it rubber bullets then? I'm not sure which. This battle waged on the barricades for 3 nights and 3 days. We were led at that time, also one of the prominent people leading that was Bernadette Devlin, who had been
She
elected.
emerges in that period, doesn't she? As a,
Yeah,
she's
yeah.
very young at this point.
She was just as a sort of student at Belfast. She was elected as an MP
That was in 1969, the Mid-Ulster by-election.
So she was part of that, and she was photographed breaking up paving stones to use as things to throw.
I was quite taken by the fact that the Unionist Stratton Mills referred to her at that time as nothing less than Fidel Castro in a miniskirt.
That's right. I mean, it was really odd. She was. The British liberal press loved her, because she was this. One of the reasons they loved her was because she wore a miniskirt, and all this. And she was this very young MP, right? One of the youngest ever. I think certainly she was the youngest woman.
I think she was the youngest before that young woman from the Scottish Nationalists got elected.
That's right, yeah. So Bernadette was great, and is still great. So again, it was a really headline capturing event, the whole Battle of Bogside.
McGuinness around at that point, Martin McGuinness.
Well, I'm just sort of coming to this. Two things happened. First of all, we defeated them because the RUC never sort of came into the area because of the defense people sort of put up. We didn't really realize this at the time, but they didn't have the forces, they didn't have the will, they didn't have the strength to come into the area. And then lo and behold, we saw these soldiers. And nobody was quite clear at the start who these soldiers were, because, who are they? Because at that time, the Irish government had been threatening to send soldiers to the border to defend the people of Bogside. And some people thought, oh, maybe this is the Irish army come to rescue us, But anyway, that was some people thought. But it turned out, of course, it was the British Army. The intervention of the British Army, which was the direct intervention of the British state, was obviously a key turning point in the whole history of Ireland, if you like. First of all, the lesson I learned from that was that if ordinary people get together, put up enough resistance, they can actually secure victories. And that was we did at the Battle of Bogside. That was a victory for us. You got a sense that you change history. And I think that was the thing, i.e., you have been part of changing history. A sense of people power, if you like, to use a phrase which was quite popular at that time. A sense of the power, what sort of people can do if they sort of organize, and if they stand up for themselves against what was a very sectarian and repressive state at that time. And the sort of second lesson was, of course, is that when the crunch came, the British government intervened and did so eventually, not that first few days, obviously, or even first few months, but did so in a way which was favorable to the status quo. When the British Army went into Belfast, because that's where there was also lots of sort of trouble at that time, they said they were intervening to keep the two sides apart. But in fact, they failed to prevent a quite sectarian pogrom attack on Catholic areas. And that, if you like, raised question marks from the very start about the role of the British Army, both in Belfast and in other Catholic areas. What happened at that time, there was a Labour government in sort of charge, And although various reforms took place in Northern Ireland in this period after the troops sort of intervened, if you like, the most crucial one didn't happen. And the most crucial one was the Special Powers Act, which was a piece of legislation which the apartheid government in South Africa had said they had wished they could have had, because it was so repressive. It allowed people to be interned without trial. It allowed flogging. It allowed widespread censorship. It allowed trials in sort of secret, all these things, The thing which the Labour government didn't do was repeal the Special Powers Act. They kept that in place. And this was described at the time by many as a huge mistake by the sort of British at this time, because by not doing that, they lost the confidence, and the British Army lost the sort of confidence of many within the Catholic communities. When the Belfast rescue mission, so-called, by the British Army didn't work, or wasn't really tried, then the Catholic people there decided that they would have to look to themselves to defend themselves, and that basically saw the birth of the modern IRA, the Irish Republican Army. The Troubles grew in Belfast, especially Derry as well, and barricades were sort of set up in these areas, and people acquired guns to defend the areas, and again Belfast especially. And so the sort of British Army, if you like, role was to get rid of these barricades, right? And so various fights and struggles and shooting wars broke out to sort of do this, and an attempt to get into the Catholic areas and break down the growing resistance. The British government, which was then the Heath government, introduced internment without trial. And so, if you like, this was the final answer, we thought at the time, well, many people thought at the time, to the whole civil rights issue. Because the civil rights issue, which had started of simply demanding normal bourgeois liberal human rights, and the final answer was internment without trial of those people doing that, right? And you didn't have to be in the IRA to be interned. Indeed, many of the leaders of the left wing of the civil rights movement were thrown in jail without trial, including Michael Farrell, who's mentioned. And the Bloody Sunday, again, it started with a march. There was a march to protest against internment. That march was banned by the British and by the Northern Ireland government at that time. And of course, when that march started, it was the people on that march were 14 people were shot dead, 13 who died at the scene and 1 who died later, and that became Bloody Sunday. And there was a march and protested against that the following week, which I was part of. I was actually asked to be a minder for Vanessa Redgrave, no less, who came to us. Now, the last thing Vanessa needed was anyone to mind her, but anyway, I mean, I suppose there was this few that be better sort of look after. So I was asked to mind her anyway for this march, and that march passed off peacefully. But that was the last. That was the last civil rights movement. March of the civil rights movement, because people drew the conclusion that when you shoot 14 people dead who are peacefully demonstrating, then the time for other tactics has come.
Bernadette Devlin's still in Parliament at this point, and she clashes with Maudling, the Home Secretary, I seem to recall.
That's right. Well, I mean, it was a total disgrace, because
it's protocol usually that if an MP is present at an event that's under discussion, that they will be called.
Maudling gets up to make the excuses, which became commonplace, that that the troops were fired on first and all this, and they're only responding, which anyone who was there knew wasn't the case, And Bernadette grabbed his hair and pulled his hair and so on. But I mean, that was what the British press howled against, her grabbing Reggie Maudling's hair, not the fact that she hadn't been allowed to actually speak, in the sort of House of Commons. And again, that was part of the estrangement, if you like. Obviously, Bloody Sunday. And before that, when the British Army had imposed a curfew on the Falls Road, which is the Catholic area in Belfast, actually a military curfew, people weren't allowed out. And that wasn't imposed by the British government directly. It was imposed by the British Army. So there's basically military rule in parts of Belfast at that time. So obviously the conclusion many people came to is that the old enemy, the old British enemy, was now there. the whole British sort of enemy, and that included the sort of British army who had killed the 14 people. They were the enemy from sort of this sort of point on, and the idea for peaceful demonstrations and pacifist tactics had gone, and so the war broke out.
So the picture you paint of a civil rights movement demanding equal rights for Catholic workers in the face of employment and housing discrimination, copying sort of peaceful techniques from elsewhere in the world, facing violence that we'd not seen on the British mainland for many, many generations. You would have thought that the British left would have been very much involved and very supportive, but the British left never really understood Ireland, has it, Geoff? And your recent book you published, Hesitant Comrades, talks about the response of British socialists to the partition in the 20s. In 1979, you were writing about the cost of bipartisanship. I remember reading a book by you called Troublesome Business with, I think it was Merlin Rees, cartoon of him on the front page. What's the British left's problem?
I mean, it's a very sort of interesting question, and I don't have one simple explanation for that. In the earlier period, the sort of time when Ireland was partitioned and the time of the Irish War of Independence, the word hesitant came from a sort of letter, an open letter sent by the Irish Labour Party and TUC, which was a single organisation at that point, and said, "Comrade, why are you so hesitant about supporting us when you support anti-imperialist struggles everywhere else in the world?" This was something which a lot of us have tried to figure out. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union said it was because of allegiance of the British working class towards the British Empire. And anything seemed to change, that sort of empire became treated with suspicion or even worse, right? Because their first affiliation was to the British state, was to the British Empire.
There's very honourable exceptions, wasn't there? Because Sylvia Pankhurst, who a lot of people listening will no doubt have heard of through the suffragette movement, took a very different view to the mainstream of the Labour movement, didn't she, on this question?
It's quite sort of interesting. Because for the big Hesitant Comrades, I did a lot of research into the various newspapers of the left at that time. And I mean, Sylvia came out with her flying colours, so to speak. The interesting thing is that the significant role, and she defended the 1916 Rising, she defended the Irish in the War of sort of Independence, she eventually criticised the treaty and all this. And this significant role which Sylvia Pankhurst played in this has largely been ignored even today by those who write about Sylvia Pankhurst. So, I mean, even as if it's some sort of guilty sort of secret that she was supporting these nasty members of the Irish Republican Army, if you like, at that stage of sort of what it was, And I mean, even now, you will look at the biographies of sort of Sylvia Pankhurst, and her heroic role in this Irish question is largely underplayed or even ignored. One of the reasons she adopted this view is because went to the meeting of the World Socialist Movement hosted by the then victorious Soviet revolutionaries. She was told off by the leadership of the Comintern, the Soviets, for not doing enough to support the Irish. And Sylvia came back, and her articles became much more militant after that on the whole Irish question. So she took it very sort of seriously. The rest of the British left, even the Communist Party, although they made the correct judgment, didn't weren't involved in a really active sense in these struggles. And indeed, Lenin said it was a disgrace that no members of the British Communist Party had ever been put in prison for taking the side of the Irish against the.
Interesting. How does Connolly fit in? The cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is
right.
the cause of Labour. He's obviously trying to bind the national question with the socialist question at this point.
Connolly, of course, was born in Scotland of Irish parents. Before he went to Ireland, he was the founder of the Socialist. He was one of the leaders of the Socialist Labour Party, which had been formed in Glasgow as a left-wing version, as a left-wing party, a sort of semi-Marxist party, if you like. When he went to Ireland, he became a trade union leader, first and foremost. He lived in Belfast, and he developed an understanding of the nature of the Protestant working class, which in my view is a sort of understanding which maintains a strong relevance. But he then became involved both in the Irish national struggle and in obviously the trade union struggle, and eventually played a leadership role in the 1916 Rising. And he said on his death cell, so to speak, he says, when he was about to be shot and sort of executed by the British for his role in the 1916 Rising, but he said, British socialists will never understand why I am here.
Has much changed? Has the British left got any better?
If you look at Hansard and the various discussions which have taken place in the British House of Commons during the Troubles period, and ever since, and even now, then you will find something very, very, very sort of interesting. You will find the leader of the opposition spokesperson on Northern Ireland always thanks the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland for letting him or her see what the Secretary of State was going to say before they said it. And this was a convention that grew up and is still in place. So it's not like, say, if the government minister is making a statement on how, labor strikes or any other subject, they make a statement and the opposition responds to that statement. They haven't seen the speech in advance, the proposals in advance. When it comes to Ireland and Northern Ireland, they always have. And so there's always been this bipartisan approach, and it's still there, largely. It's sort of still there now, that somehow Ireland is outside of party politics. Right?
This reminds me of a statement that Jeremy Corbyn recounted from Joan Maynard, who was a very big supporter of the Irish cause when he first became elected to Parliament. That he said that he was taken aside by Joan Maynard, who said, Jeremy, if you find the front benches of both parties are ever agreeing with each other, we're on the other side.
And Joan was great. I mean, Joan spoke out for the cause of Ireland, for the cause of Irish self-determination, for the cause of British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. From the earliest stage onward, she was always very, very strong in that. She made some brilliant speeches on it. And again, I did a sort of interview with her, and at sort of one stage, and she was brilliant. And she looked at me and said, and this interview took place in the sort of House of Commons, and she looked round and says, this place is not for working people.
By the 1970s, I understand you'd moved to London, and you were then involved in establishing the Troops Out movement. What did you hope to achieve? And when you set up this new organisation, the Troops Out movement, how were you received on the British left?
The original aim was to campaign on the Irish issue amongst British people, right? And it wasn't, if you like, which had happened in the past, so much an Irish community organisation, right? And it was specifically aimed to try and educate, if you like, the British people about what was happening in Northern Ireland at this stage. And so it said the problem is not the Irish people, the problem is the British troops and the British government's presence in Northern Ireland. And that tried to change the whole agenda the whole way the story of Ireland was being put over the bid. I mean, the thing that was being said at that time was that Northern Ireland was about these two crazy tribes, the Catholics and the Protestants, fighting each other, and the British Army was there to keep them apart. I mean, and this was overwhelmingly the propaganda. Britain has an Irish problem. It's that Ireland has a British problem. And I mean, that was the message the troops out movement, which played a very, very sure valuable role.
So, but you were infiltrated by the Metropolitan Police's Special Demonstration Squad at that time.
That's right. I mean, they tend we know at least 3 or 4 sort of people, you know, who were sort of agents at the time. I mean, you knew more or less at the time. It sort of got to the stage where if you didn't think that was sort of happening, then you're pretty naive people, and because I mean, you know, people very showed up at sort of meetings and sort of offered to drive people here and drive people there, things like that, which they did, and the tactics became quite sort of well known, and you know, nobody bothered much about that, you know, because I mean, it wasn't going to stop you doing anything, you know.
I always thought in the 80s, one of the interesting things about Ireland is it gave us a very clear insight into how our state was prepared to act if it felt it necessary. And I remember speaking to Liz French, the Kent miner's wife from Women Against Pit Closures, about her experience of visiting Ireland during the strike. And suddenly she's meeting women involved in the Armagh strip searchers campaign. And she's thinking, I get this now. I really understand what this is all about.
I think that's right. No, it was. I mean, absolutely true. I mean, we always said this, and indeed there was a sort of a couple of books about this, about how the techniques used were a lesson for the left, but they were also a lesson for the state, because the state refined the sort of techniques, right? You know, of sort of infiltrating groups and all those sorts of things. I mean, it's the things the state got up to in Northern Ireland are quite horrendous. There was this pub in Belfast, Catholic area of Belfast, right, which was blown up. This was 1972, I think it was. Said this bomb was being assembled by the IRA in this pub, and that was the reason this bomb went off, and this is why people died. That statement was completely false, and they knew at the time it was false. And various attempts, eventually a loyalist group claimed responsibility for this, and there was somebody who went to prison for it. But the group who have done that, members of that group who have done that, have since said that they were assisted in this bombing by British Army agents. And the British state still refuses to release documentation about this bombing. And the reason they say they refuse to release documentation, i.e. what their inquiries found out, was because of the role of British agents. And they say, we cannot talk about this bombing for national security reasons. In sort of other words, the British state, either before or afterwards, by way of a sort of covered up this bombing, which they were actually part of. You know, and this was just a normal pub in Belfast where people had drinks. And it's all in a book written by Brigadier Kitson, who actually recommended. Kitson was sent over to the British Army, I think in 1971, because one of the sort of techniques was to set up gangs of sort of local people to operate against the people fighting for their own freedom. He did that in sort of Kenya, and he did it in Northern Ireland too. And this was you hear books about this, and this is sort of what you have to do. And this sort of bombing of this pub was an example of that. It was aimed to discredit the IRA, which is why within 12 hours of that bombing going off, the British Army issued a statement saying this was a result of the IRA bombing their own pub by mistake, or trying to assemble a bomb. And the whole thing was total nonsense, and it's been proved to be total nonsense since.
You were engaging in Irish politics in the late 60s and 70s. I first became engaged in 1981 during the hunger strike. And it turned out, with hindsight, to be a hugely pivotal moment in Irish politics. And what was it about and what made it so important, Geoff?
The prisoners who were arrested under the emergency legislation, either be the Special Powers Act or the Prevention of Terrorism Act or the Emergency Provisions Act, were granted special recognition of the nature of their crimes, that they weren't criminals in a sense. They were involved in this struggle, and so they were jailed, obviously, and they were jailed either they were interned without trial, or they were convicted in sort of kangaroo courts, or they had the right for a long time, for instance, to wear their own clothes, to assemble. Eventually, both the Tories and the Labour government abolished those rights and said, no, you're not special. You're just criminals, right? You're just criminals, and you will be treated like other criminals. Republican prisoners protested about this, and this eventually, and the removal of these rights led to eventually the hunger strike, right? In which Irish prisoners died, and again, it was a argument, is the type of argument I've been talking about. And those hunger strikers were in many ways the sort of victims of what Northern Ireland had become, but they were, of course, treated as the guilty people, and any idea that they had any political motivation was brushed aside by both the Tories and the Labour government. Says no, they're just criminals, And so, essentially, that's what the hunger strike was about. Hunger strike was simply a demand for political status, to sort of recognise that their crimes were political crimes, even though they might have killed people, even though they might have done various sort of things which normal court would put people in jail for. Nevertheless, there was a political element in those crimes, and that is what the Irish hunger strikers claimed, and this is what the British denied.
It's interesting for people listening that aren't familiar with this period that Bobby Sands is elected. He dies on hunger strike, and then his agent stands on his behalf in the by-election that he's caused by his death in 1981, and he gets 31,000 votes.
That's right. And I mean, that I think did. I mean, I think the hunger strike did, because up until that point of time, up until Bobby Sands stood, the Irish Republicans tended not to stand for election, right? That's a bit of an overgeneralization, but I mean, it was only after Sands won that the sort of tactic of the ballot box began to be put forward by.
Isn't it around about this time that the Adams, Morris, and McGuinness wing starts to emerge in Sinn Féin that are much more interested in this new approach?
Adams came time and time again to sort of Britain to give talks to me, and I was with him lots on those occasions, speaking with him, and it's like when Seamus Heaney, Seamus Heaney one time came to Northern Ireland when he wasn't such a famous poet, but he was still quite a famous. He was going to lecture about Ireland at some Oxford university, and he was stopped on the way there. He was asked, "Mr. Heaney, what are you coming to this country for?" He was stopped under the PTA, and he said, "I've come to educate the English about Ireland," you see. And they then arrested him under the PTA when he said that remark, and he spent a few hours in prison. I mean, and which again is something people don't talk about very often about Seamus Heaney, but I mean, Adams was doing this all the time. And I mean, Adams' car was full. I was in the car. We were always followed by the British state in these cars that we were driving around sort of England and so on. This, and I mean, that was I mean, everybody sort of knew this was sort of happening. But I mean,
I remember this period well. This was the period when Owen Carron comes over to Labour Party conference the year he was elected in 1981. There was 53 resolutions on Ireland that year at Labour Party conference, which is something of an exception in the Labour movement's history, as we've discussed. But then Adams comes the next year. I remember meeting him, and I was a local at that point, and we gathered a number of local Labour movement figures together to meet him, and he came round to my place for a pizza. It was a period in which the Labour left was beginning to engage with Sinn Féin and open a dialogue. How important, looking back, do you think that sort of breakthrough where the Labour left was prepared to talk and listen to Sinn Féin and other Irish voices? How important was that?
The breakthrough came, I think it was in 1980, was it? The breakthrough came when Tony Benn made a statement. Because Tony Benn at that time was the leader of the left, and he hadn't said anything about Northern Ireland. I mean, he wrote a book about the Wilson government. I think it was called What Went Wrong or something like that. And he never mentioned Northern Ireland in that book. And he came up to I think it was the 1980 Labour Party conference, and he made a statement about Northern Ireland. And it began by saying, first of all, I want to apologise for not mentioning Ireland previously. And then he said, I've been always taught by my father that the partition of Ireland was a crime, and it still is, right? And the cause of Ireland became associated with the Bennite movement from that point onwards, right? And the Irish cause, the Irish agitation in Britain, that was a real turning point, because here it was, the leader of the British Labour left saying, you're right. I stand by the view that Ireland has a British problem rather than Britain having a sort of Irish problem. And Ben was very good after that, and what he said. So that was a very significant part, and it was a very significant part of building up a movement to look at Ireland afresh, And I think, the whole roots of the Good Friday Agreement and so on, one of the roots is that Tony Benn took up the Irish question, and it was fabulous that he sort of did that, It was fabulous because it almost became something we could sort of talk about, right?
Remember in 1983, the magazine that at various points that we were both involved in, London Labour Briefing, carried a front page. This is its April 1983 edition. By Danny Morrison, who was the publicity director of Sinn Féin at the time. And the headline, interestingly, was Give Us Peace, which I think made a real impact at the time. And it goes back to what you were saying, that Ireland's got a British problem.
Yeah.
He was clearly defining that the cause of the violence lied in our country, not his, and he wanted the British to give him and his people peace.
No, that's true. Danny was brilliant. The Irish Republican movement produced people of leadership of such sort of qualities, even now, you go to any Sinn Féin meeting now, held in London, and you ask the platform speakers, the Sinn Féin speakers, question.
They answer it.
They will answer that.
You might not agree with it, but they answer the question.
They will answer it, And it's amazing. Politicians which answer questions. Good heavens. What have we got here,
When we talk about the Labour left in that period, there's been a lot said about it. It was said again during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership as a means to slur him as supporting the IRA. And we were both around at that time. And I was quite clear in my mind when we were publishing articles by the likes of Danny Morrison, and we were organising fringe meetings at Labour Party conference for Gerry Adams and Owen Carron, what we were doing. And I think what was in our minds was we were open to a dialogue with Sinn Féin that were gagged at that point and weren't allowed to speak in the British media. We could see that there was a new perspective emerging amongst the Sinn Féin leadership, and we thought it was our responsibility to allow that to have a voice. And as you said earlier on, we believe very strongly that the Irish themselves should determine their country's future, and that Britain was the problem, not the solution. However, and I think we were all very clear about this at the time, there was no suggestion around Jeremy, around Ken Livingstone, John McDonnell at the time, that anybody in Britain was either being asked or wanted to back the IRA's military campaign. It was all about respecting the right to Irish self-determination.
The sort of leaderships were really frightened of that, political leaderships. I mean, I'd sort of tell the story about the film that sort of helped to make.
Ah, yes, I hear that Mr. Kinnock didn't welcome your entry into Channel 4 production.
That's right. I mean, so we sort of made, three of us made this film called Pack Up the Troubles. It was headlined as, and we said that it was the first program on any British television channel to argue for troops out. Right? It was a direct film arguing for that, for troops out of Ireland. And we produced this opinion poll to support this of British people who wanted the troops out and who said that the British Army was part of the problem, not part of the solution. The day the film was due to go out, or the day before the film was due to go out, Channel 4 got this message from the leadership of the Labour Party, Kinnock's office, saying, we can't allow you to show this film because this film tells lies, right? And Channel 4 said, give me an example of the lie. And they said, you said that a member of the British Labour Party, a representative of the British Labour Party, had discussions with Sinn Féin. And at the time, he says, oh, no, we never discussed. We don't talk terrorists. And so Channel 4 came back to me and says, well, it's in the interview we had done with this Labour representative, Northern Ireland Shadow Secretary of State, Peter Archer. And there's a newspaper reports which said that Peter Archer had discussions with Sinn Féin councillors, right, about housing issues or something. There was absolutely clear evidence that we were right. And so Channel 4 went back to the sort of Labour Party and said, no, we have got sort of evidence to sort of prove this, that these talks took place, right? So then the Kinnock's office said, okay, well, listen, we won't take out an injunction against the film being shown at all, but we do demand that you withdraw this reference, and the filmmaker withdraw this reference, because we maintain it wasn't the case, even though we had proved it was the case, right? But because we had proved the case, eventually Channel 4 told them to piss off, right? And said, no, we're sort of showing the film and it's full, right? And if you want us to take us to court, right? But they didn't in the end. But I mean, they were doing this. I mean, the issue was, this is the irony of the whole thing. The issue was that the Labour Party were talking to Sinn Féin, you know? And so, you know, a few years down the line, there was Tony Blair, you know.
To bring the first half to a close now, we've looked back at the pivotal moments of Irish history, and after a short break, we're going to be back and we're going to look at the political position in Ireland today. Are we going to see the end of the Union?
Well, we're going to see it sometime. We're going to see it sometime. I mean, it is now a question of when. Research paper was done by the Economic and Social Research Institute in Northern Ireland recently, last week actually. And it compared economic and social and employment and education and hospital waiting list time of Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, the 26th county state. And in each of these measurements, each of all the measurements they undertook, Northern Ireland lagged behind. I mean, that was in terms of the standard of living, hospital waiting times, the number of doctors, the number of nurses, the number of people who finished university, the number of people who went into nurseries, you know. And each of these things, the Irish Republic has really significantly outstripped Northern Ireland. So there is now a real economic and social case for a 32 county Ireland, right? And as the people, and it's not that sort of, as used to be the case and was the case, is that the people of Northern Ireland are giving up their sort of welfare state to join this backward 26 county state. That's not the argument anymore, because that's not an argument which can be sustained, especially since Brexit, when the decline and the difference between the two states has increased even more. So that sort of argument has gone. Having said that, of course, the majority of Protestants still remain opposed to that type of arrangement, right? But not as big a majority as there has been in the past. And so the British state as a whole, I don't think, have the same economic and social interest and defence issue interest in Northern Ireland that they sort of once had. The whole ties between the sort of British people, and they like to think the sort of Northern Irish people, hasn't existed for many, many years. Opinion polls from the 1970 onwards have said the majority of British people don't want anything to do with Northern Ireland,
So what's the route map to get to the referendum and to get to the point? There seems to be a growing consensus that such a thing is likely at some point.
Yeah. Within Ireland itself, a lot of work is being done on that, on what this roadmap is. Which, I mean, for instance, if you compare the Scottish national question to the Irish question, the Scottish national question is associated with the SNP by and large, right? Mm. The Irish unity question is not by and large associated with Sinn Féin, although Sinn Féin are obviously supporters of it, right? But the prime movers at the moment are organisations like this organisation called Ireland's Future, which have done proposals on the economic structure of a 32 Ireland, the National Health Service issue of a 32 county Ireland, what civil liberties would look like in a sort of 32 county Ireland. They produced all these papers, and all these discussions are sort of taking place in sort of Ireland. And they're, I mean, it's actually very, very interesting what's sort of going on. And this is throughout Ireland, right? They hold meetings throughout Ireland. And they have talks on these topics. And I mean, they suggest that the step forward should be citizens' assemblies to discuss these proposals in greater detail now. And this is to an attempt, only, to avoid the technical mistakes which occurred over Brexit, right? To have a sort of educated audience out there. I mean, Ireland, to have, these are the things which we're talking about. These are the things that can be achieved, right? And to an extent, those are the most important things taking place. I mean, all we're asking for at the moment, state your criteria for calling a referendum. Now, is a nice little moderate demand. We're not asking to go around wearing an Irish flag, waving an Irish flag or anything. Just state the criteria for holding a referendum, which is a very reasonable demand. And sooner or later, they're going to have to do that, I would have thought.
South, what's happening in the 26 counties from a left-wing perspective?
Sinn Féin is now the leading left-wing party in sort of Ireland, and I think we can sort of say that. And the leading left-wing party, because organisations like the Irish Labour Party went into coalition with Fianna Fáil and all this sort of stuff, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and joined up with these right-wing parties, right? Sinn Féin, I mean, the sort of leadership of these right-wing parties don't want, obviously, to go into coalition with the Sinn Féin anyway. But I mean, so the sort of situation gets a little sort of complicated. And the situation gets more sort of complicated because if there was a 32 county election now in all of Ireland, then Sinn Féin will come out on top. I mean, there's no absolute question about that, because it's the only party that stands in the north and the south, So it comes second in the north, and it comes second in the south, and it comes first in the north. So if you put those 32 counties together, you're going to have a Sinn Féin government, right? At the moment. I mean, things can change, politics can change, political parties can sort of change, and so on and so on. We all know that. But that is the situation at the moment. And that does mean the Tory parties or the centre-right parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, mightn't be quite so keen to have a 32 county Ireland, because it'll mean that they're losing power, to the sort of Sinn Féin. So all these things are sort of complicating factors. But at the same time, it was very, very sort of interesting that, in sort of my view, when there was a commemoration of 1916, the 100th sort of anniversary, that sort of started out as something to attract tourists to Ireland. We'll hold a march here, then, as a tourism thing. It became much more serious because it meant that people were looking at what 1916 Rising wanted, the type of society the leadership wanted to build, and looked at the 1916 proclamation for an independent Irish republic, which again promised, if you like, people's power, which took up economic issues, socialist issues. And this was the Irish Revolution. And there became in Ireland a real discussion on the nature of 1916 and what type of society Ireland was now in the present world, and that how it hadn't measured up to the hopes of 1916, to the dreams of 1916, how there was still too many poor people. There were things like housing and so on, which were still horrendous issues, right? And I think what happened in that period was that there became a movement in sort of Ireland as a whole to look at the social question, the economic questions, and how these tied up to the partition question, and how one fed on the other, so to speak. And that discussion really has been going on ever since, And I think I'm quite sort of hopeful of what a wonderful opportunity, you and I would like to have to be able to do, and to make our wishes, our dreams, our thoughts achieve some sort of recognition and reality. I think it's great.
Why do you think there's such a great affinity between the Irish people and the Palestinian people?
Northern Ireland was a settler community, and that's where it comes from, right? Israel is a settler community, and that's where that comes from, I mean, and then the sort of native lands were sort of taken off, the lands were taken off the Irish people and given to the British settlers in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and so on. And the lands in the sort of Middle East being taken off the people who lived there. So, I mean, and given to the Israel state. So, I mean, that sort of affinity is sort of there. But, I mean, there's other things that's going on. I mean, it is very sort of interesting that there was this group of mercenaries called the Black and Tans who fought in the Irish War of Independence on behalf of the British and committed all sorts of horrible acts. When the Irish War of Independence ended after the First World War, what did the British government do with the Black and Tans? They sent them to police Palestine, where they had a mandate, and then under the sort of League of Nations mandate. So they became the chief British lawmakers, if you like, or surveyors or imposers. They became one of the chief repressive forces in the Palestine at that time.
So, Geoff, before we finally move on to you naming your class hero of the month, what would Labour for Irish Unity like those of us on the Labour left in the trade union movement to do?
Well, there's sort of two things here. First of all, Britain has to come clean about its historical past and in the North, and the issues I've talked about like the bombing of this pub I sort of talked about, and have many other incidents of British collusion with sort of loyalists. I mean, the record has to be put straight. Nobody's looking to throw people in jail for 50 years and sort of like that. It's just that. And the second thing, obviously, is that Britain does have to state, and the Labour government does have to state, and has to discuss with us, or discuss with the Irish people, or discuss with the Irish government, or discuss with the power-sharing government in the North about the criteria for calling a border poll.
So join Labour for Irish Unity, and I'll put the details in the podcast notes.
Yeah.
It would be a good question to ask your next CLP, your constituency Labour Party members. Ask your Member of Parliament What's the criteria for the border poll that Britain promised in the Good Friday Agreement?
We used to demand troops out now, which is quite a sort of absolutist demand, if you like. Or just saying, well, please tell us the criteria. That is how much we've achieved or how much we've gone so quiet. I don't know. Other people can judge that. Well,
I think we should leave on the point that the reason why that request is so important is because in your and my lifetime, Irish unity is in sight.
That's right.
It's not because everybody has moderated their demand. It's a hugely important moment.
Yeah. No, it's almost there. It's almost there, and we would sort of like to see it in our lifetimes. Yeah.
You've talked about lots of inspirational people today, but I'm really interested to find out who your class hero of the month is.
The obvious candidate, at least the obvious candidate for some people might figure as obvious, would be James Connolly, right? I think the thing about Connolly was, Connolly, first of all, was a great writer, right? He wrote some agitational sort of articles and papers and books and things, but he was also a great sort of theorist too, right? It wasn't simply a sort of agitational. He was a great theorist. He understood the nature of the Protestant working class better than most people before, sort of since, for instance. And of course, he was an activist, right? He was a trade union activist, he was a labor activist, and he was a Republican activist, right? And I think those three traits, great writing ability, very good theorist, and most of all, a sort of activist, means he should be. He certainly inspired me, right? And he did, and he's someone I would still read. You can still learn from him today.
A Connolly book to start with. Where would you start?
Well, I would start with Labour in Irish History, a 100-page booklet, which if you can get that. But there's also various collected works of his floating around. But Labour in Irish History, which tries to come to terms with the labour question on the one hand and the national question on the other hand, and how these two combine. If you can get a copy of this, and a very old copy of it would be of his collected work, which was edited by Peter Beresford Ellis, which was a Penguin special about 30 or 40 years ago. If you can get that on that sort of second-hand site anywhere. That is probably one of the best collections of his books.
I think Connolly is a good choice. And maybe in the words of Connolly, we should say to all the Labour watchers to this today, stop being hesitant, comrades. Listen to Connolly. The cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland, and the cause of Ireland is the cause of Labour. That's what we want you to take away from this podcast, I reckon.
Yeah, thank you, Bryn. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Okay, right. Bye.